United States, we've always done motorsport a little differently. Some of our most iconic racing venues have been derived from horse tracks or defunct airports. But there are some road courses that were designed with the European motorsport legacy in mind. Tracks like Watkins Glen and Road America ripple through undulating tree-lined hillsides in an attempt to echo continental classics like the Nürburgring or Spa-Francorchamps. But there are some significant differences between our road courses and those of classic European fame. Ours are much shorter, and while they share names with their street circuit ancestors, the actual modern tracks were rebuilt far away from the tracks that initially carried their name. But why? Why suddenly did these sprawling town center tracks all pick up stakes and move to purpose-built courses somewhere else? Why did the course of American motorsport history abruptly change? The answer lies with a young 7-year-old boy named Frankie Fazzary and a tragedy at Watkins Glen. Motorsport isn't just about fast cars and daredevil drivers. It's a place where scandals burn hotter than exhaust pipes. This is a history podcast dedicated to delving into the darkest corners of the racing world to uncover secrets, deception, and intrigue. My name is Elizabeth Blackstock, and welcome to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. After World War II, Watkins Glen quickly transformed into the premier location for anyone serious about motorsport in the United States. But how did this sleepy hamlet in upstate New York become so addicted to speed? To tell that story, we need to understand the evolving roles that motorsport has played in America and just how distinct that has been from the rest of the world. Oval track racing had existed in America prior to World War II. After all, it was pretty easy to transform any horse racing track into an automobile racing surface, and plenty of cities and towns across the country had local fairgrounds where a horse racing track was already built in. America saw a boom in prosperity after World War II, but it took a while for innovations in production and technology to actually make it to the automobile. So many former car manufacturing facilities had been transformed to produce war goods instead. Plus, big purpose-built tracks like the Indianapolis Motor Speedway had fallen into disrepair after racing came to a halt when the action started. So, for the first few years after the war, racing was primarily done on those oval tracks with pre-war cars. Despite the fact that everyone likes to credit Henry Ford with saying that auto racing first started 5 minutes after the second car was built, he wasn't actually huge on the whole organized motorsport thing. At least, certainly not in the same way that his European compatriots were. Ford defined the American automotive market with practicality and not innovation in mind. He wanted to build efficient, reliable cars that could reasonably transport Americans from one place to another. Over in Europe, though, the big minds behind automotive brands like Peugeot, Renault, Bentley, Rolls-Royce, Maserati, and Aston Martin were dedicated to performance. Over there, cars weren't just for practical puttering around between high society homes. Instead, cars were beautifully crafted objects of passion and art. There were plenty of models that were available to the general public, but the big focus was on pushing boundaries and crafting machines that were more powerful, more beautiful, and more enduring. And then, to test those qualities, automakers used public roads as proving grounds. Europe's public roads also enabled that kind of testing. While not every rural road was well maintained, there were many high-trafficked paths between cities and towns that had been in use for centuries. Those roads might have only been large enough for an ox cart, and they were probably very rough. But they did exist and had done so for ages. By contrast, the early Americans who attempted to drive across the country were met with wide open plains, mud fields, and a whole lot of nothing. Conditions had improved by the start of World War II, but by that time, America already had a defined racing tradition, and it involved oval courses. But members of the American military who had been shipped abroad during World War II came into direct contact with a whole new automotive world that had previously only been available on the pages of specialist motorsport publications. They saw firsthand the nimble sports cars that were being produced on the other side of the Atlantic, and they saw many of the sprawling roads that had created long-standing events like the Mille Miglia, as well as the roughly enclosed tracks that had created classic races at Le Mans. It was an entirely different way of thinking about motorsport, and it had an impact on the folks who returned to the United States with a new way of experiencing adrenaline and a hunger for a different kind of vehicle. Plus, without any new American cars being built, many Americans of means simply started importing the new-to-them European models that they had fallen in love with. There would have been no point in buying any of these machines if you didn't have an opportunity to race them. So, organizations like the Sports Car Club of America, also called the SCCA, stepped in to help sanction meets and races and to develop a new road racing scene here in the United States. The SCCA turned to the British club racing scene for inspiration when it set out its rules, which basically meant that it wanted to remain an amateur organization. Any driver who joined the SCCA essentially agreed that he would not accept any kind of compensation for competing in any event, be that prize money, wages, or even snacks from local companies. If you're wondering why that mindset smacks of elitism, that's because elitism was the whole point. The SCCA was primarily composed of rich waspy types that could afford to invest in a gorgeous imported Bugatti, but who otherwise had no motorsport skill. They didn't want their organization being overrun by the working class dirt and oval track racers who actually had a lot of established talent, but who competed in motorsport as a way to make a living. The SCCA's mindset also differed from that of continental Europe, which didn't hesitate to offer prizes or entry fees to the drivers who took part in its events. But the SCCA couldn't do everything on its own. Every burgeoning organization needs a few enterprising members to really push the boundaries and grow membership. And one of the first men to do that in post-war America was Cameron Argetsinger. So, tell me the last time you saw some very good motorsport merch and thought to yourself, oof, that looks good. When is the last time you actually got hyped about a merch launch that didn't come straight from a Daniel Ricciardo or a Pato Award or one of your favorite teams? Can you even remember? I can. Last Friday, a little shop in Speedway, Indiana called Homefield Apparel launched its first ever motorsport collection, a vintage-style drop celebrating NASCAR's Hendrick legends like Jimmy Johnson, Jeff Gordon, and Tim Richmond. Do you want a sick Folgers hat just like Tim Richmond? Homefield has one. Do you want Jeff Gordon's Rainbow Warrior jacket? Homefield's got that too. Do you want a retro-looking 7-time t-shirt? You can definitely get it at Homefield. I am so proud that Homefield and I have partnered for the 2024 season. The Hendrick collection is only the first of 4 motorsport-themed collections that they'll be launching this year, and I promise you do not want to miss what's coming up next. Check out the link in my bio to sign up for updates on the coming launches, and when you buy, don't forget to use the discount code DPTJ15 for 15% off your first purchase. Cameron Argetsinger wasn't born and raised in upstate New York, but his ties to Schuyler County ran deep. Born in Youngstown, Ohio, on March 1, 1921, Argetsinger spent his summers at a family lake house in Watkins Glen, a quiet little town tucked into the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York. Argetsinger's father was a corporate lawyer for Youngstown Steel and Tubing, so the family never lacked for the fineries in life. And for a young Cameron, that involved a lot of automobiles. The Argetsinger family was always equipped with the latest Packards, and as a teenager, Cameron devoured the sporting magazines that reported on the massive successes of German marques like Mercedes-Benz and Auto Union at New York's Vanderbilt Cup. When he received his very own Packard 180 Darren Victoria for his 18th birthday, it was only natural that he took the convertible to Watkins Glen to try setting personal speed records through the streets he'd grown up on. In 1941, he got married, spent a few years in the war, and then returned home to earn a law degree from Cornell University. Argetsinger first got involved at the SCCA while trying to buy a Duesenberg from one of its members, but because the Duesenberg didn't count as a proper sports car, Argetsinger was confined to being only a subscribing member rather than a participating one. But that did not stop him from dreaming big. See, young Cameron had fallen in love with the idea of organizing and hosting a European-style race right in the middle of his favorite town, Watkins Glen. According to Philippe Defechereaux, the writer of Watkins Glen, The Street Years, Argetsinger said, "I was truly thinking of bringing all of the great European teams and champions, and to see Watkins Glen become the first American site to stage major European-style international road races annually." As Argetsinger saw it, the challenging roads that carved through the small hilly village were the perfect place to stage America's version of, say, the German Grand Prix held at the Nürburgring. And he wanted to do it properly, too, to start and end the race right in the middle of town. By Christmas of 1947, Argetsinger had driven the streets of Watkins Glen so many times that he almost certainly could have visualized their every detail when he closed his eyes. And that's also likely what made it so easy for him to design his ideal track on the floor of his family's home. Using magazines to represent road sections, he recreated some of his favorite driving routes from memory and employed toy cars on each one to test the racing line. After he'd fiddled with the different track iterations that would amount to somewhere between 4 and 8 miles, Argetsinger found his answer. Now, he just needed to find a way to bring the magazine track to life. It didn't seem like it would be an easy feat. At first, that magazine model track was all Argetsinger had, but that didn't stop him from inviting around friends and townspeople to offer him feedback on what he'd put together. And shockingly, it was enough to convince all of the right people that this young man had dreamed up a frankly impressive method of generating tourism. Argetsinger's proposed 6.6-mile track had its start on Franklin Street, the main drag of downtown Watkins Glen. The start line was marked out across from the courthouse, and the track wound east through the hills and dales of the region. It featured multiple road surfaces, including cement, oiled gravel, dirt, and macadam. It had plenty of tricky bends, a narrow stone bridge, an impressively steep downhill curve that led the field back into town, and a railroad crossing. To really give you a sense of the track, I want to extensively quote Bill Milliken, an aerospace engineer who doubled as a racer and who also helped found the Watkins Glen Grand Prix. Milliken writes, "Down the long stretch from White House Corner, the driver has his hands full as the car takes punishment from the surface roughness and he wrestles with the dips and camber changes of the road. He slows slightly, negotiates the bends, then finally brakes and shifts for Schoolhouse Turn and literally dives toward Stone Bridge. Another shift, more heavy braking, and he's past the bridge and accelerating through the valley. A series of tricky bends finds him approaching Archie Smith Corner, which must be taken in low gear and at moderate pace, and then a fast bit of gravel leading to the railway crossing. At this point, the harder sprung machines aviated for some distance as they took the tracks at unabated speed. Seconds later, with Friars Bend behind, they may be seen at a really high speed on that long, sweeping downhill stretch known as Big Bend. Skill and judgment are at a premium, and speed must be reduced for the famous S back onto Franklin Street, and then a smooth, glorious run up the home stretch." Argetsinger decided on an early October race date, which would showcase the beauty of the changing leaves, and with some rudimentary safety measures in place, the SCCA gave Watkins Glen the seal of approval. Because the proposed circuit ran across a set of railroad tracks, officials even managed to negotiate with the New York Central Railroad Company to rearrange train schedules on race day so no trains would pass by until the event was over. By mid-September of 1948, over 35 drivers had submitted their entries, most of them driving heavy pre-war vehicles or modified machines. As the air began to chill and autumn descended, Argetsinger knew his race had potential. In fact, he thought he'd struck gold. October 2nd, 1948, race day for the inaugural Watkins Glen Grand Prix. All throughout the week, dedicated motorsport fans began to descend on the small town of Watkins Glen. Officials estimated that 10,000 people had arrived, effectively quadrupling the town's small population in a matter of days. Local police and firefighters woke early to keep order during the pre-race concours car show, and soon after, chapters of the Boy Scouts and American Legion arrived to help. In order to prevent any undue stress on the town, Watkins Glen requested that all racing activities be confined to a single day. First came the concours, which was followed by a brief 4-lap junior prix for small displacement engine cars. Shortly after would be the Grand Prix itself, an 8-lap sprint race that was ultimately delayed due to some expected inefficiencies in the timetable. There was no practice, there was no qualifying, and the starting order was determined by a draw. Thanks to the amateur nature of the race, there were plenty of folks competing that we probably don't remember today. Many of them were local to upstate New York and had even contributed to the creation of the event itself. Perhaps the big star of the show was Briggs Cunningham, an entrepreneur who would go on to pilot the yacht Columbia to win at the 1958 America's Cup race, while also building unique cars to compete in races around the world. In 1948, though, he was still hard at work building his profile. As far as the cars went, it was quite a mix. The race itself was divided into several classes, which meant that you were able to watch brand new MGTCs face off against cars from previous decades. Briggs Cunningham even brought a special, which was the name for a vehicle that had been heavily modified by the owner. In this case, Cunningham's machine was called the Boomerang. It included a Buick engine and chassis overlaid with the body of a Mercedes. When the flag dropped to signal the start of the first ever Watkins Glen Grand Prix, a field of 15 cars thundered to life and rocketed down Franklin Street. Frank Griswold in an Alfa Romeo was first to reappear at the start line 30 seconds ahead of the field. However, reliability wasn't exactly at its best in the era, so as the laps ticked away, several drivers were forced to retire. Cunningham was freed up just enough to attempt mounting a challenge against the leader, and he got as far as leading the field before he was overtaken. After a thrilling 8 laps, the 1948 Watkins Glen Grand Prix was won by Frank Griswold Jr. behind the wheel of his 1938 Alfa Romeo 8C 2900B. He set a lap record with a time of 5 minutes and 46.1 seconds, which meant that he averaged 68.5 miles per hour. The total time elapsed for the 52.8-mile Grand Prix was 49 minutes and 41 seconds, with an average speed of 63.7 miles per hour. Despite the delays and the relatively small crowd, the inaugural Watkins Glen Grand Prix was a massive success. The drivers gushed about how it was the finest event they'd ever contested, and fans had been delighted by the novelty. The Watkins Glen Grand Prix organization decided almost immediately that it would stage another race the following year. It may not have been a spectacle that could compete with the hours-long endurance events of Europe, but it was an extremely promising start for what was a seemingly unheard-of racing discipline in America. It also had a lot of ripple effects. Briggs Cunningham was inspired enough to decide that he'd start building his own cars to enter European races. The SCCA had established its first marquee event in North America and was so bolstered by the success that it immediately began exploring options for future events throughout the United States. But that was still to come in the future, and we'll get there in a moment. For now, let's focus on the evolution of the Watkins Glen Grand Prix over the next few years, because the expansion was absolutely mind-blowing. In fact, race organizers almost immediately began the process of planning for the 1949 running as soon as the checkered flag flew in 1948. Everyone knew the event had been successful, and with more time at their disposal, they knew they could craft something exceptional. That meant that there were a few changes, the largest of which was a move of the race date. While the weather had been pretty much perfect in 1948, organizers didn't want to risk the unpredictability of New York's autumn. So, the race date was shifted 2 weeks earlier to mid-September. Next, the junior event was renamed the Seneca Cup, and the Grand Prix itself was lengthened from 8 to 15 laps in an attempt to get a little closer to approximating the distance of a European race. That length meant that drivers would have to pit once during the event, where they'd be topped up with a mandatory gallon of fuel. Finally, the Grand Prix classes were tweaked so that their engine displacement ranges more actively mimicked those of international racing. As a result of the previous year's successes, the grid for the 1949 running of the Grand Prix practically doubled, and the field grew to accommodate a much wider range of European vehicles. Crowds also increased dramatically, with some sources claiming that 5,000 more spectators had descended on the small town of Watkins Glen than the year prior, for a total of 15,000 viewers scattered around the track. A more diverse field of more powerful vehicles meant that the lap record dropped from 5 minutes and 46.1 seconds to 5 minutes and 12.2 seconds, making for an average speed of 75.38 miles per hour. That second Watkins Glen Grand Prix had pretty much been perfect. More cars in the field also meant that more American specials were doing battle with the sophisticated machinery of Europe, just as Cameron Argetsinger had hoped. More and more SCCA-sanctioned races were popping up across America, and several SCCA members had decided to head over to Europe in 1950 to see what they could accomplish overseas. And 1950 was a massive year for motorsport. It marked the first ever season of Formula One, a series of regulations dictating a handful of Grand Prix races that would ultimately crown a world champion at the end of the season. Germany, which had largely stepped back from motorsport after World War II, looked as if it was preparing to return to the international stage. In America, racing fever grew, and the West Coast quickly established its presence in the racing scene. Briggs Cunningham took a Cadillac to the 24 Hours of Le Mans. Meanwhile, Watkins Glen Grand Prix organizers continued to refine its event. For 1950, an additional race was added between the 15-lap Seneca Cup and the 15-lap Grand Prix. This race would be an 8-lap Glen Trophy, which was later renamed the Queen Catherine Cup. 114 entries expressed interest in the event, and still more fans packed into the street to watch the race. The following year, in 1951, the program remained the same, but the organizers also added a driver's meeting and a practice session to the docket, and safety had dramatically improved. That year, a track-wide public address system had also been installed, both so that fans spread out around the course could keep up with the action, and so that public safety officials would immediately know of any danger. Crowd control had increased, which was a huge necessity considering that officials estimated that 100,000 spectators had turned up for the race. A new average speed of 77.65 miles per hour was set by Grand Prix winner Phil Walters, who was driving a Briggs Cunningham Special, the C2. The Watkins Glen Grand Prix was quickly becoming a staple in the American racing calendar, and hopes were high for the 1952 running. Between Watkins Glen's first Grand Prix in 1948 and its fourth in 1951, road racing fever had firmly captured the American psyche, and other folks began to realize that if a racing event could work in upstate New York, why couldn't it work in their little corner of the world? First came Bridgehampton in 1949. One of the towns that composes the Hamptons, Bridgehampton is about 100 miles east of New York City, and it had become a refuge for wealthy city folk who were ready for a more peaceful change of scenery. It was also a fantastic haven for aspiring racers and SCCA members who needed a little extra garage space to store their vehicles. Bruce Stevenson, a former B-52 pilot, and Alec Ullman, a stunning race promoter, carved out a 4-mile course on Bridgehampton's flat roads and set a race date for June 11th. As you can imagine, many of the usual suspects turned up to the Bridgehampton event. It was great practice for the upcoming Watkins Glen event in a few months, and it gave many drivers a chance to race more than once per year. Then, in 1950, we saw a huge explosion of racing all across America. Florida's Palm Beach shores hosted the first race of the new year, and the California Car Club of America, which was a very different entity from the SCCA, established its own races in Palm Springs, Pebble Beach, and Santa Ana. The SCCA calendar featured major events at West Hampton, Bridgehampton, a Studebaker test track in South Bend, Indiana, Linden, New Jersey, and Elkhart Lake, Wisconsin. Halfway through the year came the Carrera Panamericana, a rally race through Mexico, which gave Americans a perfect opportunity to compete against some of the greats from across the pond. And then was the 24 Hours of Le Mans, which had become an important target for Briggs Cunningham. At the end of the year came the first ever race at Sebring, organized by Alec Ullman on a disused airfield. Take a moment to really think about that. In 1948, Watkins Glen hosted the first road race in America after World War II. By 1951, racers across the country had more than a dozen marquee events to choose from when planning their competitive schedules. A new motorsport tradition was well on its way to being established. Despite the heady successes of the Watkins Glen Grand Prix weekends and the reverberations they'd had throughout America, not everything had been perfect. In fact, as the event approached its 5th year, organizers had their hands full. First and foremost, the unprecedented success of the event meant that no matter how well the town prepared for the race, it was always caught off guard when fans rolled in. As the years passed, Watkins Glen hired more police and erected more barriers, but event delays due to uncontained crowds had become fairly common. Then, in 1950, a tragedy struck. Sam Collier had become one of the most important personnel in the American racing world. He and his brother Miles had joined Briggs Cunningham at Le Mans, and he had helped found the Automobile Racing Club of America, which would ultimately join forces with the SCCA. He hadn't quite found luck at Watkins Glen, and as he was leading the Grand Prix in 1950, the tires of his Ferrari 166 SC lost their grip on a long straight by the railroad bridge. Unable to make the turn at the end of the straight, Collier veered onto the gravel and tried to save his machine, but it wasn't to be. The Ferrari skittered sharply across the road and launched into a grassy meadow. Bill Milliken, who was closely following Collier at the time, reported what he saw. "This was only the second lap, and I was trying to regain the lead. We all loved racing for the camaraderie, but being a competitive bunch, we were also driving to win. Knowing that there was gravel over the apex of that wide corner, I stayed more on the outside than Sam. The next thing I experienced was a sharp ding of a small boulder landing in my cockpit. Then I saw the Ferrari get into a slide and catapult end over end in the green meadow. Now focusing on the next turn and approaching the Stonebridge section, I suddenly and joyfully realized that I was in the lead. After my harmless rollover on the hard asphalt of 4th Street 2 years before, I was not overly worried about Sam. The open meadow seemed such a cushy landing spot." Seat belts and helmets were mandatory safety equipment for all racers at the Glen, and Collier should have been able to walk away from that accident unscathed. Instead, his seatbelt anchor had broken almost as soon as he left the road. Collier was thrown from his car, still alive but completely motionless. He died almost as soon as he entered the hospital. The Watkins Glen Grand Prix continued on, seeing another spectacular flip, albeit without the fatal consequences. But in that morning's Seneca Cup, a wayward car had also thrown a fireman to the ground. The fireman survived, but it was the first dark mark on the young race's history. And that wasn't all. By 1951, race founder Cameron Argetsinger had been effectively removed from the event's organization, thanks to a very significant deviation in his ideals compared to that of the SCCA. It was no surprise to anyone that Argetsinger's dream for Watkins Glen had always been international. He desperately wanted the course to play host to the professional racers of Europe that he had admired from the pages of his sporting magazines. However, there was absolutely no incentive for those European greats to bother with the race. The SCCA sanctioning barred professional racers from competing, and even if a man like Sterling Moss had been allowed to start the race, he would have been disappointed by the fact that his trip across the pond would not have been a prosperous one. No one was even allowed to offer free lodging or paid expenses for these international travelers, so they simply didn't show up. Still, in 1949, Argetsinger registered his event with the FIA, the sanctioning body that governs European motorsport. To do that, though, he had to bypass the SCCA and instead work with a different American sanctioning body, the AAA. Yes, you heard that right. The American insurance company actually used to sanction major races in the United States, such as the Indy 500. It was also the sanctioning body that negotiated internationally with the FIA. But the SCCA was not pleased to discover that Argetsinger had been consulting with a different sanctioning body, even though he had intentionally designed the running of the Grand Prix to conform to international standards. A very nasty public battle raged between the isolationists and the internationalists via letters published in different motorsport newspapers, and the ultimate result saw Argetsinger completely removed from the Watkins Glen Grand Prix organization. Even further, drivers like John Fitch and Phil Walters began to warn organizers about the potential dangers that the event could pose. In 1951, even more speed records were broken thanks to the rapid development of racing technology, but it had become very clear that all was not well. Fitch and Walters had international racing experience, and they were as close to professional as you could get while still being members of the SCCA. And they knew that the SCCA was simply not equipped to deal with the rapid development that they were seeing. They also knew that crowd control left a lot to be desired. They warned the SCCA that it was underestimating both the spectator situation and the power situation, and if those two problems were to collide, it would have disastrous consequences. But the amateur-only format had been working for the SCCA. Why change something that had been, year over year, so promising? The 1952 racing season overall was a massive one in many respects. Porsche and Mercedes-Benz represented an official racing comeback by German automakers, and the 12 Hours of Sebring represented a significant challenge to the amateur-only SCCA, which decided to host its own rival event in Florida just before the Sebring race organized by Alec Ullman. The racing schedule in America was jam-packed with events, but the 1952 Watkins Glen Grand Prix was set to be the biggest of them all. With Cameron Argetsinger entirely out of the picture, the race was run by a man named George Shannon and a slate of SCCA members including Fred Wacker and George Felton. While the racing schedule had remained largely the same, a few changes had been made in the name of pomp and circumstance, like the addition of a post-race prize giving at the local high school auditorium. Snow fencing lined the spectator areas of the track in such numbers that it's said that all local counties had donated their fences. Hay bale chicanes were erected to slow the cars on key parts of the track. The trackside communication system had been greatly improved, and a few areas of the track had been deemed no passing zones to further reduce any chances of danger. Race day dawned beautiful and sunny, but because the pre-race festivities had been going on for several days at that point, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Almost immediately, things began to spiral. After a few practice laps for the Seneca Cup, organizers decided at the last minute to remove the hay bale chicane on the track, resulting in a delay that continued to snowball throughout the day. The changes to the timetable meant organizers had to wait for the New York Central trains to pass through town, and fans needed to be herded back into place on a regular basis. After the first race of the day, the Seneca Cup, even more time passed as organizers had to remove abandoned cars from the side of the road. The Queen Catherine Cup, the second race of the day, had only just ended at 3:30 p.m. when the Grand Prix was scheduled to start. As cars lined up for the final race of the day, a reporter from Sports Car magazine reported that spectator tension was almost uncontrollable. When the green flag finally flew, Fred Wacker's red Allard leapt into action up Old Corning Hill, but two Cunningham roadsters, one driven by Cunningham himself and the other by John Fitch, gave chase close behind him. By the end of the first lap, Cunningham had snatched the lead, and Fitch was just behind him. On Franklin Street, Cunningham occupied the left lane, with Fitch in the right. Wacker tailed them both from the left lane. Just past the courthouse, John Fitch moved into the left-hand lane as Wacker attempted to overtake him on the outside. Because they were entering a no-passing zone, Fitch was shocked to discover the red car in his peripheral vision, and he veered to the right to give Wacker space. Wacker, however, was also shocked. He thought that Fitch was aware of what he was up to. Wacker veered to the left, his two tires dipping off the tarmac. Just ahead of them was a cramped spectator area. Fans had gathered 10 people deep in front of the souvenir shop, with nothing but a rope separating them from the action. Women in camping chairs and children pressed against that rope, pushing it ever so slightly further into the road. Wacker, speeding along at over 80 miles per hour, knew that he wouldn't be able to make any sharp maneuvers to pull his Allard back into the racing line. As he eased his car into position, he felt a slight thump on his rear fender. It was only as he passed John Fitch, who had slowed his car to peer behind him, that Wacker understood what had happened. As he glanced back, he spotted a thin trail of smoke rising from the utility pole in front of the souvenir shop. The crowd was in shambles. Bodies lay on the ground, surrounded by blood, crushed sandwiches, and broken glass. Something terrible had happened. To describe the situation, I want to directly quote 2 paragraphs from Philippe Defechereaux' book, Watkins Glen, The Street Years, because I don't know that I'll do it the same amount of justice he's done. Defechereaux writes, "The Allard's rear fenders were not cycle fenders as those in the front. Rather, they were a rounded affair, arching over the wheel and down, ending about a foot above the ground as they became an integral part of the car's short, curvaceous tail. They had a rounded edge where the fender's lowest curve turned sharply inside to form the rear hemline of the racer. The 1 foot height of that edge corresponds to slightly above mid-calf for an average adult leg and about face level for a squatting young child. That is exactly the part that scythed through the front row of spectators for about 30 feet in front of the souvenir shop. In the split second it took the Allard to pass by, it seriously injured 12 people and killed Frank Fazzary. The 7-year-old had his skull crushed by the wheel's winged knockoff hubcap. His father, half conscious, and his brother, stunned and in pain, lay on the sidewalk, both with broken legs." The Fazzary family were not the only ones injured that day. Several other spectators had suffered broken legs, while countless more could do nothing but look on in a state of shock. Increased safety measures had not been able to prevent the accident, but within 2 seconds of its happening, the steward closest to the action lifted a red flag, and seconds later, the race had ended. Moments after the car skimmed the crowd, policemen and army guards rushed to the scene to help. Ambulances flooded in. The loudspeakers fell silent, and fans scattered around the track were left to wonder what had happened. The world of American motorsport was about to change forever, but for the Fazzary family, their world ended in the 1952 Watkins Glen Grand Prix. By the time the accident scene had been cleared, the sky had darkened. There was no choice left but to cancel the remainder of the 1952 Watkins Glen Grand Prix. Fred Wacker was arrested by the state police and required to make a statement. Then the media descended, calling motorsport events nothing but a Roman holiday, where key participants were forced to shed blood for the thirsty gaze of a ferocious audience. Life magazine ran a large photo spread of the accident, which included Frankie Fazzary's dead body in a pool of blood. Even Motor Trend had choice words for the race. It was harsh in its criticisms of the amateur focus of the field, noting that a track as challenging as Watkins Glen should not be the remit of racers who only compete a few times a year. We don't know much about Frankie Fazzary. There's even a question about how to spell his surname. Some publications list it differently than others, but Frankie's gravestone is etched with the spelling I'm using in this episode. We know that he was local to Watkins Glen, likely growing up at 184 12th Street, just a few steps away from the local high school. We don't know much about his family, with the exception of his parents and his brother James. An obituary for Frankie in the Elmira Star-Gazette lists a sister, Frances, and a grandmother, Mary. We know Frankie was buried at St. Mary's Cemetery, which lines the village's iconic gorge. His headstone features a photo of a young boy dressed in a suit and tie. Newspapers of the era don't shed much light either. Michael Fazzary, Frankie's father, was listed as being a milk driver. We learned that the Schuyler County coroner listed the cause of Frankie's death as being accidental and that there would be no inquest. Police Sergeant J. Edward Maloney stated after the race that fans had been well within the confines of the safety ropes strung to prevent spectators from entering the road. But he also said that the group of spectators at the scene was small in comparison to other viewing areas around the track. This tragedy could have been much, much worse. In the December 21st edition of that year's Star-Gazette, Michael Fazzary was listed as one of several people who filed claims against the village of Watkins Glen. Fazzary asked for $150,000 for the death of his son, $250,000 for his own injuries, and an additional $100,000 for the injuries suffered by James, his other son. In today's money, that would be the equivalent of over $1 million. On February 28, 1953, the Elmira Advertiser featured an update about the Fazzary case as part of an article about the lawsuits that had finally been settled as a result of injuries caused during the 1950 Watkins Glen Grand Prix. There was no news about how the case was proceeding in court, but the author noted that the Grand Prix Race Board's plans for 1953 were stymied by the fact that the event would not be insured unless safety changes were made. In 1954, the suit was finally settled out of court. Part of the settlement was that the terms of the deal never be announced. In later articles, though, we learned that Michael Fazzary had asked for less money, a total around $230,000 instead of the $500,000. In the aftermath of the tragic Watkins Glen Grand Prix, politicians passed a law that said no additional permits would be issued for races taking place on public roads. The repercussions of that decision rippled throughout all of the United States. Politicians in the rest of the country soon either banned road racing outright or found loopholes to do so, such as what New York had done, by refusing to renew permits for organizations to close public roads for racing events. Insurance companies refused to cover racing events or racing drivers. Even if the Watkins Glen Grand Prix organization had wanted to stage another race, it would have been prevented from doing so right at the very start. Unfortunately, that also meant other tracks, like Elkhart Lake, were also forced to call it quits. Road racing on actual public roads in America was dead. But in the aftermath, motorsport fans rallied together. They weren't quite ready to relinquish this sport that they had grown to love. In the towns where those road races had taken place, Grand Prix organizations changed their goals. They began to raise money to build permanent tracks, ones that could be designed with ample safety measures in mind. Spectators would be kept well away from the action, and organizers could actually charge entry fees to attendees, since they would no longer be able to simply gather on the side of a public road. But there was another type of venue that saw its profile raised in the wake of the road race bans. General Curtis LeMay, leader of the Strategic Air Command and overseer of many Air Force bases around the United States, was a massive motorsport fan, and he was generous enough to negotiate with sanctioning bodies like the SCCA to transform disused airfields into racetracks. It didn't cost the government anything, and LeMay could simply organize races around the Air Force training schedules. Then, by charging entry fees to the event, LeMay could repurpose the profits by channeling them into improvements to the living conditions for service folks who resided at the base. Fascinatingly, Fred Wacker was a critical part of this racing revival. In September of 1952, just before the Watkins Glen Grand Prix, Wacker first met General LeMay at Elkhart Lake. He quickly realized that LeMay was probably the most important man in the United States, second only to the president, thanks to the control he had over the Air Force, and that LeMay had access to ample amounts of unused racing tarmac. The two quickly began negotiations, and the first event after the fateful 1952 Watkins Glen Grand Prix was held on October 22nd. It took place at Turner Air Force Base in Albany, Georgia. The SCCA had found a much-needed lifeline, and the organization latched onto it immediately. It was the only way that motorsport could survive. The long, flat stretches of airport tarmac did not make for particularly compelling racing, at least not of the kind that Cameron Argetsinger had wanted to emulate based on the European example. American race fans had fallen in love with Argetsinger's style of racing too. Thankfully, when LeMay was forced to stop lending taxpayer-financed public land to a private club in 1954, replacement circuits had been built. First was the stopgap course at Watkins Glen. Organizers selected a hilly section of the town of Dix and quickly began to set about paving rough dirt roads to create a permanent course. Financing began on July 15, 1953, with the racetrack's debut ambitiously scheduled for that same September. The SCCA was completely unconvinced that an appropriate track could be built in time, and it refused to sanction the event. I think the best way to put this is by quoting Henry Vaillant, a journalist. Thus, with fixed determination, when confronted with an outlawed circuit and being vehemently denounced by the opponents of road racing, and having lost the goodwill and guidance of the State Department of Public Works and the state police, and being told by the SCCA that they wouldn't sanction the race on another circuit, and there being only 40 working days to construct a new 4.6-mile circuit, and with no money, the community proceeded to plan for the 1953 Grand Prix. And on September 17th, the day before the track opened, they had done it. Over 100 entries signed up for the race, and fans flooded into the freshly erected grandstands. Snow fences lined the track to prevent spectators from getting too close, and a control tower served as race headquarters. All things considered, the event was a success, and the SCCA decided to sanction the race the subsequent year. There was just one problem. The drivers hated it. They hated the revised Watkins Glen track. Organizers had not built in enough escape routes, and there were plenty of concerning blind corners thanks to the hilly nature of the track. After the 1954 event, it was clear that the course would either need to be significantly altered or a new one needed to be built altogether. Then things got even more challenging. The SCCA began to demand hefty sanctioning fees, so the Watkins Glen Grand Prix Corporation decided to forego sanctioning and do the heavy lifting themselves. It bought 550 acres of land to build a brand new track, then scheduled the first race for mid-September in 1956 and set to work, only for an unusually rainy year to delay that work. The track had only been paved the day before practice, and without the required time to cure, the track surface began to break up, and the SCCA warned drivers not to race. Nevertheless, the event went ahead, and to everyone's surprise, it was almost perfect. By 1958, Watkins Glen Grand Prix founder Cameron Argetsinger was back in action and was so bolstered by his event's success and the proud state of the new track that he began to solicit international attention. Formula One had tried hosting ill-fated Grand Prix at both Sebring and Riverside before it decided to give Watkins Glen a try in 1961. The upstate New York racetrack served as host of the United States Grand Prix until 1980. If you go to Watkins Glen today, you'll know that it's a town that embraces its rich racing past. Stroll down Franklin Street and you can't help but notice the names of legendary racers carved into the sidewalk, a commemoration of all of the fantastic competitors who took victory on various iterations of the track. Men like Roger Penske, A.J. Foyt, and international stars like Joaquin Bagnaia. The town hosts the International Motor Racing Research Center, which houses a massive collection of books, magazines, films, cars, and more that chart the birth and evolution of motorsport here in America. Head into any one of the several antique shops in town, and you're sure to find treasures like old race programs or ticket stubs. In almost every store, you can find a free pamphlet that tells you how to drive the old course. There are memorials for the race's founder, Cameron Argetsinger, one that commemorates Sam Collier and his death, and one that commemorates the fact that Watkins Glen hosted the first road race after World War II. In fact, the starting line is still painted on the sidewalk. And yet, for a town that prides itself on its respect of the past, there is very little recognition for young Frankie Fazzary. There are no plaques or monuments or quiet moments set aside to remember the 7-year-old's tragic death. It was an accident, yes, but it was one that irrevocably changed the course of motorsport history in the United States, and it was one that shook a small town to its core. Instead, Fazzary is something of a footnote. I have a library chock full of motorsport literature, but I have noticed that it is rare for me to encounter an honest mention of the death that changed American racing. In many books I've read about Watkins Glen, I've seen Fazzary's death recorded in a number of ways. I've seen it listed as nothing but a spectator death, which gave little credence to the fact that a child was involved. I've seen his death entirely passed over, as some historical records simply claim that Watkins Glen needed to find a closed course home due to general danger and an inability to charge for tickets. Sometimes there isn't even a mention of why the public road track needed to become a permanent facility. It's like it just happened, spontaneously, out of nowhere. That has a snowball effect. If we've forgotten why Watkins Glen had to change circuits, then we've also likely forgotten why Elkhart Lake became Road America. It means we probably don't remember why events on private land or decommissioned air bases were so popular, namely that it was a lot easier to control crowds and implement rudimentary safety measures when you could build your track out on a wide, flat swath of land. We also probably don't remember that there was a period of time where road racing almost died in America. As a result, we can also forget that rather than dying, American motorsport transformed. Before Watkins Glen, only 2 road courses existed in America. After Watkins Glen, America introduced over 60 new tracks, 10 of which came within the first 10 years of Watkins Glen building its semi-permanent circuit. We forget so much of what makes racing in the United States such an outlier on the world stage. We forget what makes it special. But more than anything, we've forgotten the 7-year-old boy who squatted between his father's legs to watch a race. We've forgotten that a young life was cut short. We've forgotten Frankie Fazzary. The next time you tune in to a race on a permanent American road course, I hope you'll take a moment to remember Frankie Fazzary, to honor the memory of someone so critical to the sport that we know and love, and who was ripped from the arms of his loving family far too soon. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. In the next show, we'll be covering the strange tragedies that have surrounded both of Formula One's American world champions. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show, give it a great rating, and leave a review. And if you're hungry for more, make sure to subscribe to the DPTJ Patreon. Tiered patrons will receive exclusive access to weekly blog posts where I delve deeper into contemporary motorsport news, as well as newsletters that round up the biggest events that you should be paying attention to. Plus, if you'd like to send me an email, I have an address for that: deadlypassionsterriblejoys@gmail.com. I'd also like to take a moment to say thank you to everyone who has left reviews, comments, or ratings, particularly to the folks who have offered feedback on how to improve. I am a writer by trade, which means figuring out the nuances of this audio-visual realm are still challenging. Every little bit of expertise and advice helps out to make the next episode even stronger. Plus, don't forget to check out Home Field Apparel. The Hendrick collection drop was incredible, with retro-style shirts, hats, and jackets inspired by legends like Jeff Gordon, Tim Richmond, and Jimmy Johnson. The next few drops will be open wheel themed, so if that's more your jam, make sure you're signed up at the link in my bio, and don't forget to use code DPTJ15 for 15% off your first purchase. Finally, we're ending with La Source, the segment named after the iconic turn at Spa-Francorchamps, but that serves as my bibliography for each episode. It's important to me to be able to cite regularly and accurately, so I'm giving a shout out to some of the most influential sources at the end of each show. You can also find a full list of sources in my episode description. The primary source for this episode was Watkins Glen, The Street Years, Glory, Drama, and the Birth of American Road Racing by Philippe Defechereaux. This exceptional book involves a ton of research and so many first-hand accounts of the growth of the iconic Watkins Glen race, as well as plenty of contextualizing information about international racing and global politics. I also referenced Watkins Glen from Griswold to Gordon, 50 Years of Competition at the Home of American Road Racing by J.J. O'Malley and Bill Green. Other key sources were newspaper accounts pulled directly from the archives of newspapers.com. Thank you again for tuning in to Deadly Passions, Terrible Choice.